Hi, I'm Chip Rogers, and welcome to the Educational Experience. Thank you for joining us this week as we continue and finish up our series on regulation, its impact on small businesses, and more specifically, Obamacare. My guest again this week as we finish this series, to my left, Misty Challey, who is the Executive Director of the Coalition of Franchisee Associations, and to her left is Ben Domenech, and he's with the Heartland Institute, a libertarian think tank that provides public policy in many different arenas, including healthcare. So in our last episode, we talked a lot about Obamacare, how it's going to impact the individual, how it's going to impact the business owners. And that, of course, is just one, and I mean, it's a big one. It's one of the biggest regulations ever. But it's in a series of regulations that have really, over the last few years, ramped up. One of the stats I wanted to throw out that, and you talked about this in one of our earlier episodes, Ben, is that while this one is going to be felt probably by a lot of American citizens, the Dodd-Frank regulation is maybe one of the worst that has ever been passed. 400 rules are necessary to carry that out. Over 7,365 pages in the Federal Registry just because of that regulation. 24.5 million man-hours every year just to comply with the first half of the rules that have already been passed. So Dodd-Frank, many years after it passed, people are looking back at it and saying, this is a catastrophe. Are we going to be saying the same thing 2 years from now once you have full implementation of the Obama health care law? Misty?
Oh, absolutely. I think we're saying it right now, and we haven't even seen the employer mandate regulations yet. You see what's coming out. Even the proposed regulations. There was guidance recently issued about when can to determine whether an employee is full time. How far back can you look to determine whether they meet that 30-hour threshold? And the guidance that came out said, well, 3 to 12 month look back. But if you do that, then you have to have at least a 6-month stability period, they're calling it, which means that if they're classified as full-time in that 3 to 12 month look back period, they have to be classified as full-time for that at least minimum 6-month stability period. So what you're going to see, and this is another way that franchisees are trying to get around this, is in the look back period, you're going to have your employees work less than 30 hours a week. They're part-time, right? So they'll be classified as part-time. And then for the stability period, they are then part-time. So what you're going to see is, regardless of how many hours they are working in that stability period, they are classified as part-time, and therefore you're not required to provide insurance for them. So you can raise their hours after they meet that look-back period, and then despite the fact they're actually working more than 30 hours a week, they're classified as part-timers. So we're seeing just nightmare after nightmare of these situations that are coming up where franchisees are just trying to survive past these regulations, and we haven't even hit the big one yet, the employer mandate regulations. So I think we are already with our hands up saying, what are we going to do here? And we will be seeing that for years and years to come after the 2014 mandates as well.
In one of our earlier episodes, you pointed out in Pennsylvania, there's a threshold of $29,000, and you see a lot of people make it up to that threshold and stop.
Yes.
In other words, government intervention into the free markets has caused people to not want to earn more than $29,000. We're going to see this on a much grander scale, a national scale, on this 30-hour cap, aren't we?
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that we should understand is, who's the regulator in this situation? The regulator is actually not going to be the Department of Health and Human Services. They're going to be in charge of the various mandates, in charge of the various requirements. But in terms of the regulator you're going to have the most contact with, it's our friends at the IRS,
exactly.
who are hiring thousands, tens of thousands of agents, frankly, in order to really try to implement this. There's going to be new requirements in terms of the forms that everybody has to fill out, things that are still being developed at this stage. And really what you have to understand is the way that they're going to come after you, according to this, is coming after your withholding, being able to come after you in the form of liens. While they can say that this is under the taxing power of the Constitution, there was always this insulation against that you couldn't go to jail because you didn't pay the individual mandate. You couldn't be thrown in jail because of failing to do any of these mandates. The penalty is much lower than that. But what you have to understand is the way that they're going to actually enact that penalty is often in the form of an audit. It's going to basically come after people and say, we're going to look at your books much more closely if you fail to meet these various thresholds. What's more, as businesses respond to these regulations and do exactly the kinds of things that you just laid out in terms of redefining the hours that their employees worked, et cetera, government's going to respond to that as well. The regulators are going to respond to that, and they're going to start cracking down in the form of saying, well, if you're going to do it this way, we're going to come back at you with something new. And I think that's
more regulation.
Exactly. You're going to see rules built on top of rules on top of rules. And frankly, this law, from my perspective, was never really designed to work to begin with. It was a mishmash of various ideas thrown together, and the ultimate result of it is going to be a massive increase in the number of Americans with subsidized care. Just assuming that we continue on our current projections, and this is not a partisan assumption, this is not one Heartland created, this is just from the CBO and from Medicare's actuary, we will have by 2020 157 million Americans whose care is subsidized in whole or in part either through the Obama exchanges, through Medicaid, or through Medicare. That's essentially more than half the country that we're going to have in a position of having their care fully subsidized or partially subsidized, and that insulates them from costs. It's going to put them in a position where these plans and healthcare generally is going to cost more and more. That's only going to create more pressure for businesses to do the kinds of things that she was talking about. It puts it all in a really wicked spiral.
And in the next segment, before we get to that, next segment I do want to talk about what are some possible remedies to this. But I think you highlighted something that I think may be part of the grand master plan, and that is if you have 157 million Americans just by 2020 that are now reliant upon the federal government for subsidizing their health care, then the elected official who supports that plan will always stay in office, and the elected official who doesn't support that plan or wishes to change it will either not be in office or never get to be in office to begin with. So when we think about what is the timing on how we change this, some of us, like the Coalition of Franchisee Associations, has been screaming from the rooftops for a couple of years now.
Right.
But you're now starting to get some listeners. They're saying, okay, this thing really is bad. The problem is the Supreme Court said it's legal. Exactly.
And what we're seeing, and we go up on Capitol Hill numbers of times every year. And what we're seeing is, a couple of years ago, let's say in 2010, when the law passed, you saw kind of very partisan, you either support it or you don't support it. You wouldn't talk about it because you kind of knew where people stood. Just a couple of weeks ago, we were up on the Hill, and you had people who supported it and continue to support it in parts, say, okay, we know that there are problems. Tell us how we can fix it, fix those problems. So while they will never, I wouldn't say never, but they won't vote to repeal the bill in its entirety. They are going to, introduce a package hopefully next year that are going to try, and I'm being very optimistic here, but to try and fix some of the issues that have arisen because of, everybody's starting to read what's in the law, as Pelosi said, and so we're seeing a lot more. Okay, give us options. What can we do? Because certainly a lot of them are saying this was not our intent to put small business owners out of business.
Well, we saw that originally with the 1099.
Yes.
That was something that everyone looked at that and said, this we cannot do.
Correct.
And it got overturned quickly.
Yes.
I guess my larger point in that is, as Ben pointed out, once we get to that number, 150, 160, 170 million Americans that now rely on this, it's going to be almost impossible to change it at that point.
It will be, because by the time people are already enrolled in the plan, it's very hard to undo. And in fact, the law does require states, not the first year, it's voluntary and not mandatory, but to require states to allow some small businesses in and to purchase their exchange, which is ultimately the federal government's exchange, and then a couple of years thereafter requiring the states to allow small business owners to purchase from the exchange. So it's going to get worse, because then you're going to have even more. It's not just going to come from the individual mandate side, it's going to come from the employer mandate side, where everybody is starting to purchase from those state exchanges.
All right, we have got to take a quick time out. When we come back, we want to wrap up this series in our last segment talking about what are some things that we could do. Let's just say we had a clean slate and we could start over. What would we do to solve this problem? It's easy to criticize, and we've done a pretty good job of that. but how do you build something that actually works? We'll talk about that coming up right after this. Welcome back to the Educational Experience. I'm Chip Rogers. Thanks for being with us today. We're talking about healthcare regulations, particularly Obamacare, and how it's impacting small businesses. And we've spent some time over the last few weeks talking about how we got here. Question is, what do we do from here? Is there anything that can be done? My guest again this week, Misty Challey with the Coalition of Franchisee Associations. She is the executive director. And Ben Domenech, he is with the Heartland Institute, a libertarian think tank. You are a policy analyst and write specifically on healthcare. So we have seen really over the last, 60 years, with the greater and greater involvement of government in healthcare, a bigger and bigger problem with healthcare, healthcare coverage, I should say. So how do we kind of reel this back in? And is it possible at this point, or have the American people been conditioned to believe this is the only way to do it?
Let's start with sort of where these problems come from. You can start at the top and you can say, government makes a decision that they're going to subsidize healthcare. What does this do? Well, it creates more demand for healthcare. When healthcare is subsidized, if you're going to subsidize something, you're going to get more of it. And so hospitals and other agencies work to meet that demand. They do so typically by merging. They make bigger and bigger hospitals that provide more and more services. But they also then have to meet all sorts of new needs from the various people whose care is subsidized. And so healthcare they charge the government more and more for these various services that are being given out. So the government reacts to that and they say, well, we can't continue this situation. We're going to have to cut the reimbursement rates for the various people who are being subsidized through Medicaid, through Medicare, through all of the various ways that subsidies happen. And so what happens then you see the doctors and everybody else who's providing this coverage, they essentially clam up. They say, we can't provide at this level, so you end up having shortages, people having to wait longer times for care that doesn't serve them well. And what you also see is essentially a squeezing of the private marketplace, where because the government is being allowed to reimburse people less and less, the doctors and the hospitals say, well, the only people we can charge more in this situation are the private insurers. And so the private insurers end up end up having to take on more costs. They end up having to charge more for their various premiums. And then people who are impacted by those premiums look at it and say, hey, the cost of healthcare is going up. We need government to subsidize it. And you start right back over at the beginning. And so what you really have there is a scenario that you have to break in order for this situation to change. What breaking that means from the perspective of Heartland and from the perspective of I think a lot of people across the country is realizing that the vast majority of healthcare needs can be met through a marketplace that looks a lot like the marketplace that every single person lives and works in today. Imagine from the perspective of government saying to someone, you know what, cars are really too complicated for you to understand. You don't know how a car works, okay? Only we at the government knows how a car works. So we should decide for you which types of cars would be right for you, what should be available in your jurisdiction, which types you should be able to drive.
Like the GM Volt. Exactly.
And then make that decision for you. Everyone would recoil from that and say, this is ludicrous, why would I do it that way? Or think about it a different way. If, let's say you come home to your house one night and you find that the light bulb that's outside your front porch is broken. Imagine if, instead of going to a store to buy a light bulb to replace it, you had to file a claim with your homeowner's insurance, who would then tell you which store you could go to buy a light bulb from. And you wouldn't know how much that light bulb cost, because you would only pay a cent or two towards the purchase of it, a copay that you would then use to take your light bulb back home. And now you can see why healthcare is so expensive and so convoluted, so crazy. You have to break that. You have to put it back at the point where it starts with the individual, where they know how much things cost, where they are within a transparent marketplace, where regulations are fewer, where you have liability reform that allows for doctors to assign tests based on whether they think that test should happen, not whether the lawyers think it ought to happen. And you have a marketplace, frankly, that is designed for our modern economy, where most people are going to have multiple jobs. They're not going to just have one employer. And so they have coverage that instead follows them from job to job. And I think the best way to do that is in the form, is frankly to take the lessons that we've learned from a state like Indiana, where Mitch Daniels put in place for government employees only, because that was the only people he had power over, an ability to to go within a plan, an option to go within a plan where the government would subsidize their coverage to a certain point, whether through an HSA, whether through a private insurance plan, however they wanted to spend it. And then essentially the employee had to pay a percentage of costs above that. So 75% for the next 1,000, 50% for the one after that, 25% for the one after that, and then above about the $6,000 threshold, the government would take the rest. What they promised the employees is that for every dollar that they didn't spend out of that initial pool, they would get that money back at the end of the year. After 3 years of doing this plan, almost 80% of the state employees are in it of their own volition, of their own choice, and the same percentage out of that gets money back. And so what you see is people start thinking about healthcare the way they think about everything else within the marketplace, as opposed to being insulated from the costs involved.
I will tell you in my experience in and out of government, the one thing that you learn as time goes on is that the market always works. It does. It actually works.
That's right.
But all right, so Misty, you've been on Capitol Hill.
Yep.
You kind of form this bridge between the people you represent and lawmakers. What is the message that can work coming from small business? What is the message that small business needs to rally around to get this fixed?
Well, I think, the thing that's worked the best is hard numbers. And it's hard to get hard numbers right now because the regulations aren't out. But we've had estimates and, we've had those in the insurance industry come in and say, okay, this is how much we think it's going to cost you. And when those on the Hill see that, they're blown away because they don't understand that, these are businessmen, this is their job, and you're taking away their livelihood. And what we're doing, when you ask your first question, what can we do to fix this? Well, we kind of take a three-pronged approach. Number one, repeal the whole thing. Well, we all know that in the current political climate on Capitol Hill, that's not going to happen, pending any type of change in the election. So, that's always number one. Number two is repeal the employer mandate. Now, there is legislation up on the Hill similar to the full repeal bill to repeal it. Now, again, political climate will not let that pass, let alone be signed by the president. The third thing that we have been going up to the Hill to do, and that has received some traction, is a proposal called profit per employee. Now, this doesn't benefit the entire business community, but does benefit those that have very small profit margins, like those that I represent. So let's say your profits are, as I mentioned, $2,300 per employee, and it's a very simple calculation. The IRS already has those numbers when you submit your taxes. But if you're below a certain profit per employee, that's really the definition of a small business when it comes to this, because they don't have the ability to absorb the cost. So what we're saying is, look at this proposal. Again, it's called profit per employee. Be happy to send it over to you, and really help those that really need the help, and exempt those that can't afford to absorb the cost. Because let's say you have a small law firm across the street. They don't meet that 50 threshold, so they don't have to comply. Well, they can certainly afford to comply with that mandate, whereas the Burger King across the street, who has more than 50, they're going to close their business because they can't absorb the cost of any type of this type of mandate. So that's something that is gaining some traction in Washington. But again, it doesn't benefit the entire business community, but it does benefit many small business owners who really will have to consider shutting their doors if this when the employer mandate comes through in 2014.
And that, you typically wouldn't think of a law like that, but when you recognize that the penalty is based on per employee,
right?
It would make sense that if you don't have enough profit to cover that penalty, then you can't have any employees, because then each employee costs you more than you can make off that employee.
Exactly.
And so this idea is getting out there, but I suspect you won't see full steam ahead until the bills start coming in, right?
Correct. I mean, I'm not a part of the Profit Per Employee Coalition. We're very supportive of it, but I know that they're working on some language in the 113th Congress that hopefully will receive some traction and might be able to benefit a lot of those small business owners out there that are really worried and hurting.
Great. Well, guess what? We're out of time. I really want to thank both of you for spending time with us the last few weeks talking about something that's critically important, not only to small business owners, but really everybody, because this will impact every American. So I want to say thanks to my guest, Ben Domenech from the Heartland Institute, and Misty Challey from the Coalition of Franchisee Associations. Thank you. I'm Chip Rogers, and if you'd like to ask any questions, send us comments, you can do so via email, chip@AAHOA.com, chip@AAHOA.com. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next week.